The auctioneer's gavel struck the podium like a thunderclap, and Birdie Dawson felt the ground beneath her boots shift in a way that had nothing to do with the dry Arizona earth. "Sold," the man in the dusty black coat announced, his voice carrying across the crowd of ranchers and speculators who had gathered in the scorching July heat of 1882, to Robert Bristol for the sum of $42.70. Birdie stood at the edge of the crowd with her hands curled into fists at her sides, her knuckles white beneath the thin leather of her worn gloves. She had watched every man in that crowd. She had counted them, studied their faces, tried to read their intentions in the way they shifted their boots or adjusted the brims of their hats. There had been 17 men at that auction, and not a single one of them had raised a hand to bid on the Dawson property until this stranger appeared. Not until the property had been declared damaged. Not until the auctioneer had read aloud the full accounting of its debts, its burned-out southern fence, its collapsed well on the eastern pasture, the unpaid tax liens against it, the legal dispute over the water rights that made it less a functioning homestead and more a tangle of obligations wrapped around 40 acres of sun-bleached heartbreak. Then this man, this Robert Bristol she had never seen before in her life, had raised his hand. She pushed through the crowd toward him, her chest tight with a feeling she could not name, something between fury and terror and something else entirely that she refused to acknowledge. He was tall, broader in the shoulders than she had expected from a man who had arrived in Cutter's Creek on a single horse with a single saddlebag, which was all anyone had been able to tell her about him in the frantic minutes before the gavel fell. His hat was good quality but well-traveled, the kind of hat that had seen weather and work. His coat was dark and his jaw was set, and when he turned to accept the deed of sale from the auctioneer's assistant, Birdie stepped directly into his path. "That is my home," she said. He looked at her then, and she felt that look land somewhere deep and inconvenient inside her chest. His eyes were a pale gray-green like the color of sage in winter, and they held an expression she had not expected to find there. Not triumph, not greed, something that looked infuriatingly almost like concern. "Miss Dawson," he said, and the fact that he already knew her name made everything worse. "You had no right," she said. "That property has been in my family for 11 years. My father built that house with his own hands. My mother is buried on that land." "I know," Robert Bristol said quietly. "Then tell me what kind of man bids $42 on a woman's entire life and calls it a fair transaction?" He did not flinch. He held her gaze steadily, and he said something that she would spend the next several weeks trying to understand, something that would unravel her carefully constructed anger and leave her standing in its place with something far more dangerous. "A man," he said, "who needed to make sure no one worse got there first." She stared at him. The crowd had thinned around them, men drifting away toward the shade of the general store or the cool interior of Callahan's saloon. The dust settled. The auctioneer was folding his papers, and Birdie Dawson stood in the middle of the main street of Cutter's Creek, Arizona, looking at a stranger who held the deed to everything she owned and spoke as though he had done her a favor. She did not believe him. Not yet. To understand why, you have to go back 6 weeks, to the morning Birdie had ridden into town to collect the mail, and found the notice of foreclosure tucked between a flower catalog and a letter from her cousin in Kansas. The Dawson homestead sat 4 miles southwest of Cutter's Creek, on a stretch of land that Birdie's father, Thomas Dawson, had claimed in 1871, when the territory was still rough enough to require a man to carry a rifle just to check the fence line. He had built the house first, a solid 2-room structure of adobe and timber, and then the barn, and then over the years, slowly and with enormous effort, he had coaxed the land into something that could sustain a small cattle operation and a kitchen garden that his wife, me, had tended with the kind of devotion other women gave to churches. Me Dawson had died of fever in the winter of 1878, and Thomas Dawson had never fully recovered from it. He kept working the land, kept feeding the cattle, kept paying the taxes with grim determination, but something had gone out of him. Birdie, who had been 17 when her mother died, had watched her father diminish slowly and quietly over the following 3 years, like a lamp burning down to nothing. When he died in the spring of 1881, he left the property to Birdie with debts she had not known existed. The debts were not from recklessness. They were from survival. A drought in 1879 had forced Thomas to borrow against the property to purchase water rights from the Kelsey family, whose well on the northern border of the county had been the only reliable source of water for 3 summers running. The Kelsey debt had accumulated interest. There had been a fee dispute with the county over the road that crossed the southern edge of the property. A fire had damaged the fence in the fall of 1880, and the repairs had required borrowed lumber and borrowed labor. Each debt had seemed manageable on its own. Together, they formed a trap. Birdie had spent the year following her father's death trying to manage the operation alone. She had one hired hand, a quiet Navajo man named Samuel who had worked for her father for 7 years and who had stayed on out of loyalty, and Birdie suspected, out of genuine affection for the land. Together they maintained the cattle, tended the garden, and kept the house in reasonable repair. Birdie had sold cattle at market in the spring of 1881 and again in the fall, and she had made payments on the debts where she could. But then the water dispute had become a legal matter. A land speculator named Orrin Hatch had purchased the Kelsey property in the winter of 1881, and Hatch was not a man interested in neighborly arrangements. He had immediately hired a lawyer from Tucson to contest the terms of the water rights agreement Thomas Dawson had made with the Kelsey family, arguing that the agreement was informal and unenforceable against the new ownership. The legal challenge had frozen Birdie's ability to access the northern well, which meant the eastern pasture, which meant the cattle she kept there, which meant a significant portion of her income. By the spring of 1882, the tax liens had accumulated past the point where she could pay them with cattle sales alone. She had written to her cousin in Kansas asking for a loan. Her cousin had written back with sympathy but no money. She had approached the bank in Cutter's Creek, but the bank manager, a thin man named Percy Aldrich, had looked at the list of her debts and the pending legal dispute over the water rights and told her, not unkindly but with complete finality, that the property was not a sound enough basis for a loan. The foreclosure notice had been expected, in the way that a person expects the thing they have been dreading. It did not make it less devastating to hold the paper in her hands and read the date of the auction, 6 weeks. She had 6 weeks to find a solution. She had tried. She had written letters, ridden to 3 different towns, spoken to lawyers and bankers and cattle buyers. The legal dispute made the property untouchable for anyone who wanted a clean purchase. The debts made it unattractive for anyone who wanted a simple investment. And Birdie herself, a 21-year-old woman running a homestead alone in a territory that still regarded female landowners with a mixture of skepticism and condescension, was not exactly a figure in whom the local financial community wished to place their confidence. By the morning of the auction, she had run out of options. She had dressed carefully that morning in her best dress, a deep blue cotton with white piping at the collar, and she had braided her dark hair and pinned it neatly, because she had decided that if she was going to watch strangers bid on her life, she was going to do it with her head up and her appearance assembled. She had not expected Robert Bristol. No one in Cutter's Creek had. He had arrived the night before, just at dusk, riding a dark bay horse that moved with the easy confidence of a well-traveled animal. He had taken a room at Harlan's boarding house, eaten supper quietly, and turned in early. Martha Harlan, who ran the boarding house and served as the town's primary information exchange, had been able to report only that he was polite, that he had paid in advance, and that he carried himself like a man who had been somewhere and done something and preferred not to discuss it. In the morning, he had appeared at the auction. Now standing in the street with his deed and his gray-green eyes and his impossible claim that he had bid on her home to protect her from someone worse, Birdie made herself breathe slowly and think clearly. "Who," she said, "did you need to protect me from?" He looked briefly toward Callahan's saloon, and she followed his gaze. Through the open door she could see Orrin Hatch's broad back, the man leaning against the bar with a glass in his hand, talking to the thin lawyer from Tucson. Something cold moved through her. "He was going to bid," Robert Bristol said. "I got to town last night and I asked about the property. Martha Harlan told me about the auction and I asked around. The saloon keeper told me that Hatch had been telling anyone who would listen that he was going to pick up the Dawson place at auction and consolidate it with the Kelsey property. He called it easy money. He said the woman on it had no leverage and no friends." Birdie felt the words land like flat stones against her sternum. She had known Orrin Hatch was her enemy, but hearing him spoken of this way, hearing herself described as a woman with no leverage and no friends, made something sharpen inside her. "So you outbid him," she said. "I outbid him," Robert Bristol confirmed. "And now you own my home. And now we need to have a conversation about what comes next," he said. He was not apologetic about it. He was not swaggering. He simply stated it as a fact, the way a man states that rain is coming because the clouds are the right color. She studied him for a long moment. He was around 30, she guessed, perhaps a year or two on either side of it. There were fine lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into bright distances. His hands, which held the deed without any theatrical display, were the hands of a man who worked. "You can come to supper," she said finally, because she had been raised with her mother's particular brand of pragmatism, which held that negotiating on an empty stomach was a fool's business. "We will discuss it then." 4 miles southwest on the main road, turn left at the fork where the cottonwood fell across the fence. You will know the house because it has a blue door. She turned and walked to her horse without another word. He came to supper. He arrived at the house at 6 o'clock, the light going amber and long across the dry grass, and he tied his horse at the post by the barn with the ease of a man who knew how to read a property. Birdie watched him from the kitchen window as he paused to look at the burned-out section of the southern fence, visible from the yard, and she could see him doing what she had been doing for a year, looking at the damage and calculating what it would take to put it right. Samuel was still on the property, having spent the day in the northern pasture checking the cattle. He came in as Robert Bristol was knocking at the blue door, and the two men looked at each other with the careful assessment of people who understand that first impressions on a homestead matter. "Samuel," Birdie said, appearing behind the door, "this is Robert Bristol. He bought the property at auction today." Samuel's face did not change expression in any dramatic way, but his eyes sharpened. "Then he is the one we need to talk to," Samuel said. "That is exactly what we are going to do," Birdie said. "Come in, Mr. Bristol. Wash your hands at the basin and sit down." The kitchen was the larger of the two rooms, and it showed the accumulated life of the family. Dawson's iron pots hung on the wall beside the stove. Thomas Dawson's surveying tools were still laid out on the shelf beside the window, as Birdie had found them the morning after he died, and had never been able to move. There was a braided rug on the floor that had been made by me from scraps of clothing, and Birdie had long since stopped being able to look at it without feeling the particular weight of inheritance. She had made a proper supper, beans and salt pork and cornbread, because she had been raised to believe that hospitality and desperation were not mutually exclusive. She set the food on the table and sat across from Robert Bristol and looked at him directly. "Tell me who you are," she said. He told her. He had been raised in Texas, he said, in a small town outside of San Antonio. His father had been a rancher who had built a modest but stable operation over 20 years. Robert had worked that ranch from the time he was old enough to be useful, and after his father's death 4 years ago, he had sold his share of the property to his older brother and come west with the intention of establishing his own claim. He had spent 2 years in New Mexico working as a cattle hand while he learned the specific landscape and cattle market of the territory, and he had been in the process of looking for land to purchase when he had passed through Cutter's Creek. "What brought you here specifically?" Birdie asked. He hesitated. Not long, but she caught it. "I was following the water situation," he said. "The dispute over the Kelsey well. I heard about it in Tucson. Water rights in this part of the territory are going to determine which properties survive the next decade and which ones fail. I wanted to understand the landscape." "And you determined that this property, with all its debts and its damaged fence and its legal entanglements, was worth $42.70. "I determined that this property had strong bones," he said. "Good soil in the northern pasture, sound construction on the house, a water situation that, with the right legal argument, could be resolved in the property owner's favor." He paused. "And I determined that Orrin Hatch getting his hands on it would be a bad outcome for the entire valley." Birdie looked at her cornbread. "That is a great deal of strategic thinking for a man who arrived in town the night before an auction," she said. "I am a strategic man," he said simply. Samuel, who had been eating quietly, looked up at that. "What do you intend to do with the property now that it is yours?" he asked. There it was, the question at the center of everything. Robert Bristol set down his fork and looked at Birdie. "That depends," he said, "on what you want to do." She felt something shift in the room, not the atmosphere exactly, but her own interior landscape, some carefully maintained wall that she had built out of necessity over the past year. She had been so completely alone in this fight. Her father was gone. Her mother was in the ground 20 yards from the back door. Her cousin was in Kansas. The bank had turned her away. The lawyers had been too expensive, and she had fought alone, with Samuel's quiet support and her own stubborn refusal to be the kind of woman who simply accepted the end of things. And now this stranger was sitting at her mother's table, eating her food and asking her what she wanted. It was the most dangerous question anyone had asked her in a very long time. "I want to keep the property," she said. "I want to pay off the debts and resolve the water dispute and rebuild what the fire destroyed and run this operation the way my father ran it, honestly and without owing anything to anyone." She met his eyes. "What I do not want is a new person to owe." "That is a fair position," he said. "Here is what I propose. I hold the deed. You continue to operate the property. I will pay off the tax liens and cover the cost of the legal work needed to resolve the water dispute. In exchange, you and I will draw up an agreement where a portion of the cattle sales each season goes toward buying back the deed. At the end of 5 years, or sooner if the income allows, the deed transfers back to your name." Silence in the kitchen. The lamp on the table burned steadily. "Why would you do that?" Birdie asked. "Because it is a sound investment," he said. "That is not the whole answer," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "No," he admitted, "it is not the whole answer." "Then give me the rest of it." He looked at the table, and then he looked at her, and she saw something move through his expression that was not entirely comfortable for him. "My mother," he said, "ran a homestead in Texas for 3 years after my father's first illness. She nearly lost it twice, once to debt and once to a neighbor who wanted the water access on our southern border. Both times, someone stepped in. The first time, it was a banker who restructured the debt without requiring the land as collateral. The second time, it was a neighboring rancher who bought a contested piece of the fence line at a fair price and held it in trust until my father recovered enough to buy it back." He stopped. "I am 31 years old. I have been carrying around the debt of those 2 men's decency my entire adult life, and I have never found a clean way to repay it. This is as close as I am likely to get." The silence was different now, softer at its edges. "Your father recovered?" Birdie asked. "He did. He lived 12 more years and died in his own bed on his own land." A pause. "That matters." She looked at him for a long time. Across the table, Samuel had gone very still in the way he had when he was listening carefully to something that required it. "I need to think about the arrangement," she said. "I need to read whatever agreement you propose very carefully before I sign anything. "I would expect nothing less," Robert Bristol said. He left at 8 o'clock, riding back toward town in the last of the evening light. Birdie stood at the blue door and watched his horse disappear around the bend in the road. "What do you think?" she asked Samuel. "I think he told the truth," Samuel said. "I think he left things out." "What things?" Samuel considered. "I do not know yet." But a man does not ride into a strange town and bid on a woman's home purely because of his mother. He paused. "I will find out what I can." Birdie nodded. She trusted Samuel's instincts more than almost anything else in her life. He had a way of reading people that she had come to rely on, quietly and completely. Over the next 3 days she thought. She thought while she was feeding the cattle, and while she was working in the garden, and while she lay awake in the dark listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. She thought about the arrangement Robert Bristol had proposed, and she turned it over from every angle she could find. The debts were real. The legal dispute was real. Without outside help, she would lose the property regardless of who bought it at auction, because the debts would follow her even if she managed some improbable last-minute refinancing. The arrangement Bristol had offered was, by any practical measure, more generous than anything else that had been available to her. The thing that troubled her was not the terms. The thing that troubled her was the way she felt sitting across from him at that table. It was a feeling she did not have much experience with, a warmth and a wariness existing simultaneously in the same space, like sunlight and shadow at the same hour of the day. She was not a woman who had spent much time on romance. There had been a young man in town 2 years ago who had courted her briefly, a soft-spoken carpenter's son named Ellis who had brought her flowers twice and then married the banker's daughter instead. She had not been devastated. She had been mildly embarrassed and immediately too busy with her father's declining health to dwell on it. The life of the homestead had consumed everything, and she had let it. Robert Bristol was not like Ellis. He was not bringing her flowers. He was sitting at her table, holding a deed to her entire existence, and offering her an arrangement that was either the most practical solution she had been given or the most elaborate trap she had ever walked into. Possibly both. On the 4th day she rode into town. She found him at the land office, where he was apparently already in conversation with the county recorder about the tax liens. She watched him through the glass window for a moment before he noticed her. He was asking precise, unhurried questions, and the county recorder, a flustered man named Garrett who was more accustomed to dealing with straightforward transactions, was clearly working to keep up. Robert Bristol was not aggressive in his manner. He was simply thorough, the kind of thorough that could not be diverted or confused. When he came out and saw her waiting, he said, "The liens can be cleared within 10 days if the payment is received by the 15th. "I have the name of a lawyer in Tucson," she said. "His name is Harrison Webb. He handled a similar water rights dispute in Yavapai County in 1879 and won. He is expensive, but he is effective." Something moved in his expression that she was beginning to be able to read, a slight softening around the corners of his eyes that indicated he was pleased by something but was not going to be theatrical about it. "How do you know about the Yavapai case?" he asked. "I spent 6 weeks looking for a solution to my situation," she said. "I read everything I could find. I just could not afford to hire Mr. Webb." "I can afford to hire Mr. Webb," he said. "I know," she said. "That is why I am telling you." They looked at each other on the main street of Cutter's Creek, and Birdie felt the air between them do something interesting and unnecessary. "I accept the arrangement," she said. "I will have my own conditions written down by tomorrow morning. You will review them and we will negotiate until we have a document we both find acceptable." "That is a reasonable approach," he said. "I want the deed transfer trigger to be 3 years, not 5, if the income supports it," she said. "And I want the right to buy the deed back in full at any time if I can secure the funds independently." "Agreed to both," he said, without hesitation. She had expected him to negotiate at least one of those points, and his immediate agreement threw her briefly. "You agreed very quickly," she said. "Those are fair conditions," he said. I was not planning to hold you to anything longer than necessary." She nodded, and she was aware that she was working very hard to remain businesslike about all of this when some interior part of her was doing something entirely unbusinesslike. "There is one more thing," she said. "Samuel stays on the property for as long as he chooses, with the same terms my father gave him: a wage and a room in the bunkhouse, and a right to tend his own plot of the kitchen garden." "Of course," Robert Bristol said. She rode home. The agreement was signed 2 weeks later, in the presence of the county recorder and a lawyer Birdie had hired for the purpose, a woman named Caroline Finch, who had studied law in Philadelphia and set up a small practice in Tucson that was regarded with skepticism by most of the territory's legal establishment and relied upon heavily by women who needed someone to actually read what they were signing. Caroline Finch read every word of the agreement, suggested 4 amendments, and confirmed that the terms were, in her professional opinion, unusually favorable to Birdie. "Did you write this yourself?" Caroline asked Robert, looking at him over her reading glasses. "With some assistance from a law book and several nights of thinking," he said. "You should have been a lawyer," she said. "I prefer open air," he said. The liens were paid. Harrison Webb was retained in Tucson. The legal challenge to the water rights went into motion. And Robert Bristol, who had anticipated that his role in this arrangement would be primarily financial and at a comfortable distance, found himself still in Cutter's Creek 2 weeks later, and then a month later, and then 6 weeks after that. The reason he gave himself at first was practical. The legal dispute required his attention as the property's deed holder. The fence needed to be rebuilt, and he had agreed to oversee the materials. There were cattle purchasing decisions to be made in preparation for the fall market. These were all true. They were not the whole truth. The whole truth was that somewhere in the middle of negotiating the agreement, and then in the subsequent weeks of early morning conversations at the kitchen table over coffee, while Samuel was already out in the pasture, he had become someone who found considerable difficulty in imagining leaving Cutter's Creek. Birdie Dawson had a way of being in a room that he had not encountered before in any room he had occupied. She was not soft or decorative in the way that people sometimes expected a young woman to be. She was precise and observant and occasionally fierce, and she had a dry, understated humor that surprised him regularly, appearing in the middle of serious conversations like a sudden cool breeze. She read constantly, whatever she could get her hands on, and she thought carefully before she spoke, and when she had an opinion she expressed it without apology. She also worked harder than anyone he had ever met. She was up before dawn every single morning. She knew the name and general disposition of every one of the 43 cattle on the property. She could diagnose a fence problem from 30 yards away and articulate exactly what materials were needed to fix it. She handled a rifle with the calm competence of someone who had been doing it since childhood, which she had. He found himself watching her in a way that was not appropriate for a man who had framed his role here as strictly practical, and he found himself unable to stop. Birdie, for her part, was experiencing her own interior inconvenience. She had determined, initially, to regard Robert Bristol as a business arrangement and nothing further. This was sensible. This was the rational position. He had bought her home at auction. The power differential between them was significant, regardless of how fairly he had structured the agreement, because the deed was still in his name, and would be until the property generated enough income to buy it back. Developing any feeling more complicated than cautious gratitude toward the person who held the deed to your entire life was a form of vulnerability she could not afford. She maintained this position with considerable determination for approximately 3 weeks. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in late August, she was trying to repair a section of the adobe wall on the south side of the house where water damage had eroded the base. She had mixed the adobe herself, the same way her father had shown her, and she was applying it with a trowel when the wall section she was working on shifted unexpectedly, and a large portion of the wet adobe came away from the surface and landed squarely on the front of her dress. She stood there for a moment, covered in adobe mud from collar to hem, holding her trowel, and the complete absurdity of her situation arrived on her with sudden full force. She had her mother's iron pots and her father's surveying tools and 43 cattle, and a deed in a stranger's name and mud on her best work dress, and she started laughing. She laughed until her eyes watered. She was still laughing when Robert Bristol came around the corner of the house and stopped dead. He looked at her. He looked at the collapsed section of wall. He looked at her again. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am covered in my own wall," she said, which set her off laughing again. And then, to her complete surprise, he laughed too. It transformed his face entirely. The controlled, methodical expression replaced by something open and genuine and unexpectedly warm. And Birdie Dawson stood in the ruins of her wall repair and felt something in her chest, complete emotion it had been building toward for 3 weeks. This was a problem. She composed herself. She cleaned up. She and Robert fixed the wall together, because he had worked with adobe before and had suggestions about the mix ratio, and they worked side by side in the afternoon heat for 2 hours, and the conversation wandered across topics with the easy range of people who had found their conversational pace matched without needing to force it. He told her about New Mexico, about the red landscape around Santa Fe, and the way the light moved differently there than in Texas. She told him about her mother's garden, and the year the garden had produced so many tomatoes that Me had spent an entire week inventing new recipes, leaving the family eating tomato-based meals at every sitting until even Thomas Dawson, who never complained about food, had finally said at supper that he would be grateful for a bowl of plain beans. Robert laughed at that story. It was a good laugh, easy and real. "What was she like?" he asked. "Your mother." No one had asked Birdie that question in over a year. The people of Cutter's Creek had known Me Dawson and expressed sympathy at her death, but no one had sat next to Birdie in the sun and asked what she was like. "She was the most competent person I have ever known," Birdie said, and her voice was steady but her throat was tight. "She could do anything. She built furniture. She set broken bones. She knew every plant in the territory and what it could be used for. She could calculate accounts in her head faster than my father could write them down." She paused. "She was also the funniest person I have ever known. She had this way of finding the thing that was ridiculous in any situation and pointing at it, just with a look, not even words, and my father and I would understand immediately, and we would all three be trying not to laugh at the wrong moment." "She sounds remarkable," he said quietly. "She was," Birdie said. "She was everything this place needed to be what it was. When she died, something structural went out of the property. Not physically, but something in the spirit of it. She smoothed her hand over the section of wall they had just repaired. I have been trying to put it back ever since." He was quiet for a moment. "I think you are putting it back," he said. She did not look at him. She was afraid of what she would see if she did, or perhaps more accurately, she was afraid of what he would see if she looked. September brought cooler mornings and the beginning of the cattle sorting process for the fall market. Harrison Webb wrote from Tucson to report that the water rights case was moving forward, that the informal agreement between Thomas Dawson and the Kelsey family had been documented in a letter that Webb had located in the county records, and that the letter constituted sufficient evidence of an existing agreement that Hatch could not simply void. The hearing was set for November. Orrin Hatch was not pleased. He came to the property one morning in mid-September, arriving in a buckboard with his Tucson lawyer, and he stood in the yard and asked to speak to the deed holder. Birdie met him at the gate. "I need to speak to Bristol," Hatch said. He was a large man, broad and pink-faced, with the manner of someone who had been given things frequently and had developed a corresponding expectation of continuing to receive them. "Mr. Bristol is in the north pasture," Birdie said. "You can speak to me." "This is a business matter," Hatch said. "This is my home," Birdie said. "Whatever business you intend to conduct on this property, you will conduct it with me present." Hatch looked at her with the particular expression of a man who finds women with opinions inconvenient. "Miss Dawson," he said, "you are in a complicated situation here. You are living on land you do not own, under an arrangement that could change at any time. I would like to offer you a path to something more stable." "I have a signed agreement," Birdie said. "Agreements can be broken," Hatch said. The threat was not subtle. Birdie kept her voice level with some effort. "Agreements," she said, "can also be honored. Good morning, Mr. Hatch." She turned her back and walked to the house, and she heard Hatch say something to his lawyer that she was not meant to hear. She went inside and stood with her back against the closed door, and breathed carefully until her hands stopped shaking. Robert had apparently seen the buckboard from the pasture, because he arrived in the yard within minutes of Hatch's departure, riding in from the north at a pace that suggested he had come quickly. "Hatch was here," he said. "He was," she said, coming back outside. "What did he say?" she told him. His expression as she spoke was not dramatic in any external way, but she had learned to read him well enough by now to see the controlled anger in the set of his jaw. "He implied the arrangement between us might be broken," Robert said. "He implied it. He did not state it directly. That is because he knows the agreement is legally sound." Robert dismounted and tied his horse. "He is testing to see if he can frighten you into accepting less. He will need to work harder than that," Birdie said. Robert looked at her, and the expression in his gray-green eyes was something she had been seeing with increasing frequency, something that she had decided for her own self-protection to categorize as professional respect and nothing further. "He will try again," Robert said. "When the water rights hearing goes against him, he will look for other pressure points." "I know," she said. "I am not going to let that happen." The certainty in his voice was not boastful. It was simply stated, the way he stated most things, as fact rather than performance. She believed him entirely, and that belief was its own kind of vulnerability. "You have been here 3 months," she said. "I have," he said. "You came to look at water rights and land values, and you have ended up managing a legal dispute and rebuilding a fence and eating supper at my table 4 nights a week." "That is accurate," he said. "Is this still a sound investment?" she asked. The question was more loaded than she intended it to be, and she saw him understand that. "It is the best investment I have ever made," he said. His voice was careful, but the words were not. She looked away, toward the mountains in the distance, copper and blue in the afternoon light. "I need you to be honest with me," she said. "Not about the property, about why you are still here." A long pause. The wind moved through the dry grass along the fence. "Because I do not want to leave," he said. She turned to look at him then, and what she saw on his face was the most honest expression she had ever seen on any human being. A man who had constructed his entire approach to this situation around practical logic, finally setting that construction down and acknowledging that the foundation had shifted underneath it. "This is complicated," she said. "I know," he said. "You hold the deed to my home. I know that too. I have thought about it a great deal. And I think there are 2 separate things here," he said. "One is the property arrangement, which is a legal document with clear terms and which I intend to honor exactly as written regardless of everything else. The other is what I feel when I am with you, which has nothing to do with the property, and which I have been trying to keep separate from it because I did not want you to feel that one was connected to the other." She was quiet for a moment. "I have been trying to do the same thing," she said finally. He took a single step toward her and she did not step back. "I do not want you to feel obligated to me," he said. "I need that to be clear. Whatever arrangement exists between us professionally, whatever I feel for you personally, those 2 things must not become entangled. If you ever wanted me to leave, I would leave and the deed transfer timeline would proceed exactly as written." "Robert," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name without the formal address, and she watched it land in his expression. "Yes," he said. "I am not someone who does things from obligation," she said. "I stayed on this property alone for a year out of love, not obligation. I have been in conversation with you for 3 months because I wanted to be, not because I felt I had to." I am telling you this because you appear to be a man who needs things stated plainly in order to accept them. I am that kind of man, he admitted. Good, she said. Then I am telling you plainly that what I feel is not complicated by the deed. I have made peace with the terms of that arrangement. What I feel is separate, and it is real, and I would like some time to understand it before either of us does anything impulsive. That seems wise, he said. You agree too quickly, she said, and there was the dry humor again, appearing in the wrong moment in the best possible way. He smiled. It was the full version of the smile this time, not the careful, controlled variation, but the real one. And Birdie Dawson decided that she was in very serious trouble, and that she had been for some time. October moved through the valley with the particular beauty of Arizona in autumn, the cottonwoods along the creek bed going gold and the air losing its brutal edge, the mornings crisp enough to see your breath, and the afternoons still warm enough to work without a coat. The days had developed a shape. Robert had taken up temporary residence in the second room of the bunkhouse, which had been empty since Thomas Dawson's last hired hand had left the year before, and the arrangement was natural enough that no one in Cutter's Creek could quite pin down what category to put it in. He was not the hired hand. He was not quite the landlord, or not in any conventional sense. He worked the property alongside Samuel and Birdie with the complete absorption of a man who has found the work he was meant to do. He was good with the cattle. He was better than good, actually. He had a way of reading a herd's disposition that came from genuine experience, and he and Samuel had developed the kind of working relationship that happens between people who understand each other's competence and respect it without needing to discuss it. He was also, quietly and without announcement, rebuilding the burned fence. He had sourced the lumber himself, making a trip to the mill in Cutter's Creek, and returning with a load that he unloaded himself at the south boundary. He had been working on it in the evenings and on Sunday mornings, section by section, in the methodical way he approached everything. Birdie had watched him from the house and felt the warmth in her chest that she had given up trying to categorize. One Sunday morning she brought him coffee at the fence line and stayed to help. They worked in comfortable silence for a long time, the kind of silence that two people only achieve when they have moved past the stage of needing to fill every space with words. The fence posts went in straight and true. The October sun moved up the sky. A pair of hawks turned lazy circles above the northern pasture. "Tell me about your dark past," she said. He looked at her. "That is a specific request." "Everyone in the West has one," she said. "I have told you about my mother and my father and every hard year this property has seen. I know about the ranch in Texas and your mother and the debt you owe to two decent men, but there are things you leave out. Samuel noticed it the first night you came to supper." He set his hammer down on the fence rail and looked out at the horizon for a moment. "There was a woman," he said. "She waited. In New Mexico. Her name was Clara. We were together for almost a year." "She was already married to another man." Birdie said nothing. "I did not know it for the first 3 months," he said. "Her husband was a cattle buyer who traveled most of the year. She had not told anyone in the area about him. When I found out, I ended it immediately." He paused, but the feeling that I had missed something essential, that I had let myself trust in a situation I should have read more carefully, that stayed with me. "Is that why you are careful about what you say?" Birdie asked. "Partly," he said, "and partly because I have learned the difference between feeling something and being certain it is what I think it is. I do not want to mistake the feeling." "You think what you feel for me might be something other than what it seems?" she asked. He turned to look at her, and the directness of his gaze was something she had gotten no more accustomed to over 3 months despite considerable exposure. "I think what I feel for you is entirely clear," he said. "I am not uncertain about it. I am careful about acting on it because the circumstances between us require care." She looked at him steadily. "I appreciate the care," she said. "I also appreciate honesty. Those two things together are rarer than either one alone." He picked up his hammer. He drove in the next nail. After a moment he said, "Clara was a mistake I made in loneliness. You are not a loneliness. You are something I would have found whether I was lonely or not." She was quiet for a long time after that. The fence went up, post by post and rail by rail, in the clean October light. The water rights hearing in November was the event that Orrin Hatch had been working to prevent for a year, and it went exactly as Harrison Webb had predicted. The letter documenting the original agreement between Thomas Dawson and the Kelsey family was admitted as evidence. The judge, an elderly man from Flagstaff named Augustus Price, who had been hearing land disputes in the territory for 20 years, found in favor of the Dawson property. Birdie was in the courtroom in Tucson for the hearing, and Robert was beside her. And when Judge Price's ruling was read aloud, she felt the relief go through her body like water. She had been holding herself against the possibility of losing for so long that the release of it was almost disorienting. Outside the courthouse in the bright November afternoon, Robert turned to her and she was already turning to him, and he held out his hand in the formal way and she shook it in the formal way, and then she was laughing again because the formality of it was completely absurd given the last 4 months. "We won," she said. "You won," he said. "This has always been your fight." She looked at him. "You funded the lawyer," she said. "That is in the agreement," he said. "That is mine. But the case, the documentation, the records, the original terms your father negotiated, those were yours. You kept that information. You maintained that history. Without that, there was no case." Caroline Finch, who had accompanied them to Tucson for the hearing and was standing 3 feet away pretending to look at something across the street, said, "I am going to find somewhere to be other than here," and walked away with a smile. In the space Caroline vacated, the afternoon was very quiet. "Robert," Birdie said, "yes. I have had 4 months to understand what I feel," she said. "I told you I needed time. You did. I do not need more time." He looked at her with those gray-green eyes, and everything that he usually kept carefully arranged in his expression was simply present. No arrangement, no management, just the plain fact of how he felt about her. "I intend to buy that deed back in less than 3 years," she said. "I want you to know that. I intend to have this property in my name, clear and fully mine." "I know you do," he said. "But I also want," she said, and she was not accustomed to saying things like this. The direct articulation of wanting was not a habit she had developed, and she pushed past the discomfort of it. "I also want you to be there when I do." He stepped toward her, and she did not step back, and on the steps of the courthouse in Tucson, Arizona, in November of 1882, in the plain light of afternoon, he kissed her for the first time with the same quality of attention he gave to everything, complete and unhurried and real. Caroline Finch, from across the street, said something to a passing stranger about the legal business being concluded entirely satisfactorily. They rode back to Cutter's Creek together the following morning, and the world of the property felt different when they returned to it. Not the physical landscape. The cattle were still cattle, and the blue door was still the blue door, and Samuel was in the north pasture when they arrived and lifted his hand in greeting without any great display of surprise. But the air of the place had changed, or perhaps Birdie had changed within it, because she walked into the kitchen and set her traveling bag down and looked around the room and felt, for the first time since her father had died, that the house was fully occupied. December brought cold nights and the comfortable work of winterizing the property, stacking wood, checking the roof seams, bringing the most vulnerable of the cattle into the sheltered area of the barn. Robert had moved from the bunkhouse into the second room of the main house, which had been her father's room and which she had not changed, and the transfer had happened quietly and naturally, the way things moved between people who had been honest with each other and trusted the honesty. He had asked her to marry him in early December. He had not made it a grand production. They had been sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the lamp between them, and he had looked up from the account book he was reviewing and said, "I want to marry you. I want to do it properly, with a preacher and witnesses and everyone knowing. I want to be your husband, and I want to live here and work this land with you, and I want this to be clear." She had looked at him across the table, her mother's lamp between them, and said yes. They were married in January of 1883 in the small church in Cutter's Creek, on a clear, cold day that turned the sky overhead into something that looked painted. The church was full, because Cutter's Creek was a small town, and small towns fill their church for weddings whether or not they have been particularly invested in the couple beforehand. Samuel sat in the front pew in his best shirt and looked at the proceedings with an expression of deep satisfaction. Caroline Finch had ridden up from Tucson for the occasion and sat beside him. Martha Harlan cried. Birdie wore her mother's dress, which had been kept in a cedar chest and which fit, with minor alterations she had made herself, as though it had been made for her. It was ivory silk with cream lace at the collar, a dress Dawson had worn in Missouri in 1869, and packed carefully for the journey west, carrying it across the entire territory wrapped in the quilt she had made from her grandmother's cloth. Robert wore a good dark suit he had purchased in Tucson. He stood at the front of the church and watched her walk down the aisle with the expression of a man who has been living prudently his entire life and has finally found the thing that makes prudence worth it. The preacher, a bearded man named Elias Croft, who had been conducting services in Cutter's Creek for 15 years and had a theological flexibility that served the community well, pronounced them man and wife with genuine warmth and only moderate efficiency. Robert kissed his bride in the bright January light, and the congregation applauded, and Samuel permitted himself a broad smile that he would have denied strenuously if asked about it later. The celebration afterward was held at the property, because Birdie had refused to have it in the saloon, and the church was too small for the number of people who arrived with food and well wishes. Tables were set up in the yard in the cold sunshine, and there was coffee and cider and an enormous quantity of food, because the women of Cutter's Creek had turned the occasion into a collective project. Martha Harlan brought 3 pies. The wife of the general store owner brought a roast. Caroline Finch, who had prepared nothing herself, but arrived with a bottle of excellent brandy from Tucson, sat near the fire that Robert and Samuel had built in the yard, and told anyone who would listen that the water rights ruling was the most satisfying case she had been involved in for 2 years. Orrin Hatch did not come to the wedding. He had, in fact, departed Cutter's Creek entirely in December, relocating to California, where his particular approach to land acquisition might find more receptive conditions. No one in the valley missed him meaningfully. The spring of 1883 brought new grass and the birth of 11 calves, and Birdie discovering, in April, that she was pregnant. She told Robert in the evening after supper, sitting in the kitchen with the lamp and the account books between them. She set down her pen and said, "I need to tell you something." He looked up. She could see him reading her expression, the way he always did, immediately and accurately. "We are going to have a baby," she said. He was very still for a moment. Then he stood up from the table and he came around it, and he held her face in his hands and looked at her with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life, something that went beyond happiness into something quieter and deeper and more permanent. "When?" he said. "November," she said, "if my calculation is correct." "Are you well?" he asked. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am strong and healthy, and I intend to continue working throughout the pregnancy before you begin formulating restrictions." "I have not said a word about restrictions," he said. "You were about to." "I was about to say," he said, "that you are the most capable person I know and that this child is going to be extraordinary." She laughed. "You do not know that." "I know their mother," he said. "That tells me everything I need to know." She pressed her forehead against his chest and let herself be held for a moment, which was something she did not often allow herself, the complete suspension of competence in favor of simply being held. He held her with the steady, careful quality he brought to everything, and outside the kitchen window the Arizona spring was performing its annual minor miracle of green. The summer of 1883 was busy and warm and full. The cattle operation was expanding, slowly and deliberately, in the direction that Robert had been planning since the winter. the additional pasture in the eastern section now fully usable with the water rights secured, the new fence section complete, the well in the eastern pasture cleaned, and restored and producing good water. Samuel had taken on 2 additional duties, overseeing the expansion of the kitchen garden and managing the records of the cattle breeding program that Robert had instituted. Samuel had also, in the spring, quietly resumed the practice of tending a portion of the kitchen garden, according to his own knowledge, growing varieties of plants that had been cultivated by his people long before the homesteaders arrived. Birdie had always encouraged this, had always asked him about the plants and what they did and how they were used, and she continued to ask. Robert had listened to these conversations and then asked Samuel directly if he would be willing to teach him. And Samuel, who did not offer that kind of knowledge casually, had thought about it for several days and then said yes. There was an afternoon that July when Birdie watched the 2 of them in the garden from the window, her husband learning the name of a plant in a language that was not his, Samuel teaching it with the particular patience of someone for whom the act of teaching was itself a form of resistance against forgetting. She felt the weight of what the land beneath her was, all the layers of it, the Dawson years and the Kelsey years and the far longer years before any of them had arrived. She thought about her mother, who had loved this ground, and her father, who had worked it, and Samuel, who had known it longer than either of them. The baby arrived in late November, a week before Birdie had estimated, arriving in the way of first children with more determination than planning. Samuel had ridden for the midwife, a capable woman named Ruth Hester who lived 2 miles to the north, and Ruth had arrived at the house and taken charge with the efficient calm of someone who had attended many births on the frontier. Robert had been present, which was not the universal custom but which Birdie had stated clearly she expected, and he had been present with the same quality he brought to everything, steady and useful, holding her hand when it was needed and staying out of the midwife's way when that was needed, and saying her name quietly in the long hours between when the only thing that helped was hearing her name said in a voice she trusted. At 2 in the morning of the 24th of November, Thomas Robert Bristol came into the world in the room where his grandfather had built the adobe walls and his grandmother had hung the iron pots, and he announced his arrival with an opinion about the temperature that suggested he was going to have things to say about everything for a very long time. They named him Thomas for Birdie's father. The Robert was Robert's idea, which he had stated was for his own father, and Birdie had accepted it and also privately recognized that it was also a small piece of continuity laid into the foundation of the child, something that did not need to be spoken. Samuel held the baby the following morning and said, in his quiet way, that the child had the look of someone who understood what he had been born into. "That is a great deal to say about a 1-day-old," Robert said. "I have said it about cattle who turned out better than their parents," Samuel said. "I will say it about a child." Robert laughed. It was the full version, the real one. Martha Harlan came to see the baby and brought food for the household for a week, which was practical and moving in equal measure. Caroline Finch sent a letter from Tucson with legal congratulations and a small silver rattle that arrived 3 weeks later and was immediately beloved by Thomas Robert Bristol, who demonstrated even at 2 months of age an appreciation for things that made interesting sounds. The first year of Thomas's life ran parallel to the continued recovery of the property. The eastern pasture was now producing at full capacity. The spring cattle sale of 1884 was the best the property had seen in years, not quite what it had been in Thomas Dawson's best years but approaching it, and Robert had sat with the account books afterward and told Birdie that they were on course to meet the deed transfer trigger the following year, 1 full year ahead of schedule. 2 years, she said. 2 years, he confirmed. She looked at him across the table. Thomas was asleep in the crib that Robert had built in the corner of the kitchen, the same corner where me Dawson had kept the bread rising in winter. The lamp was between them, the same lamp. "You said 2 years when we wrote the agreement," he said. "I agreed to 3. You were right that 2 years was achievable." "I usually am," she said. "You usually are," he agreed. She smiled. "When the deed transfers, I want to add your name to it." He was quiet for a moment. "You do not have to do that," he said. "I know I do not have to," she said. "I want to. This is our home. I have known that since approximately October of 1882, when you spent 3 Sunday mornings rebuilding my fence without mentioning that you were doing it." "The fence needed to be rebuilt," he said. "Robert," she said, using the particular tone she had developed for the moments when he was being deliberately unremarkable about things that were not unremarkable. "Yes," he said. "Put your name on the deed with me," she said. "It belongs there." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she felt the warm solidity of his grip and the fine calluses across his palm from the work of the place they had built together. "All right," he said. The deed was transferred in the spring of 1885, 2 years and 4 months after the auction, on a warm April afternoon at the county recorder's office. Garrett, the recorder, had been present at the original transaction, and he looked at the paperwork with the thoughtful expression of a man who has seen many land transactions, and recognized that this one had taken a particular shape he had not seen before. Birdie Dawson Bristol and Robert Bristol, joint holders of 40 acres, the eastern pasture water rights fully resolved and documented, the liens cleared, the property in better condition than it had been in a decade. Garrett stamped the transfer with a care that was not strictly required by procedure, but seemed in the moment correct. "Congratulations," he said. On the ride home, with Thomas on Robert's lap on the saddle because the boy was 2 years old and already fascinated by horses and impossible to keep off them, Birdie looked at the deed in her saddlebag and felt the particular feeling she had been working toward for 4 years settle into place. Not triumph exactly, but completion. The thing that had been unresolved in her since the morning she found the foreclosure notice in her mailbox had resolved. Not because someone else had fixed it for her, but because she and the man beside her had done the work together, honestly and with full attention, and the work had held. "Are you satisfied?" Robert asked. "I am," she said. "Are you?" He looked at their son, who was examining the horse's ear with intense scientific interest, and then he looked at her, and the expression was the complete one again, the real one. "More than I have ever been at any point in my life," he said. Thomas declared something authoritative about the horse's ear in the approximate language of a 2-year-old, and they rode home in the Arizona spring. The years that followed had the particular quality of a life that has found its proper shape. Not without difficulty, because the frontier required difficulty the way it required water and hard work, and the occasional willingness to face down an Orrin hatch and not blink. But the difficulties came within a framework that held, and the framework was not the property documents or the legal agreements, though those mattered. The framework was the two people who had met in the most improbable of circumstances, over the sale of everything one of them had ever owned, and built something that neither of them had been specifically looking for and both of them had, it turned out, needed completely. In the fall of 1886, Birdie discovered she was pregnant again. She told Robert in the same kitchen with the same lamp, and he had the same expression, and she said, "This is beginning to become a habit," and he said, "I hope so." And she laughed, and he held her, and outside the window the cottonwoods were gold. In the spring of 1887, their daughter arrived, Margaret Mee Bristol, named for Robert's mother in Texas, and for Mee Dawson, whose iron pot still hung on the kitchen wall. She arrived with considerably less drama than Thomas had, and regarded the world from her first hours with an expression of calm evaluation that Robert said was entirely her mother's. "She looks like herself," Birdie said, looking at her daughter. "She looks like whoever she is going to be." "That," Robert said, "is already formidable." Thomas, who was 3 years old and deeply invested in being the person who explained things to everyone, spent the first week of Margaret's life explaining to her, at considerable and remarkably detailed length, everything he knew about horses and cattle and the garden and the mountains, which was impressive in volume if uneven in accuracy. Margaret listened with the tolerant patience of a newborn, and occasionally fell asleep in the middle of his explanations, which Thomas accepted as the natural resting point of any long lecture. Samuel had been present at both births, in the house but outside the birth room, making coffee and keeping the fire in the yard burning and greeting each child when they were brought out to be introduced to the morning air with the ceremony he gave to things that mattered. He had placed his hand on Thomas's head on the morning of his birth and said something in his own language, quiet and private. He did the same for Margaret. Birdie had asked him once what he said. "I tell them the name of the land they are born on," he said, "the real name, the one that was here before the other names." She had thought about that for a long time. In the summer of 1887, with Margaret 3 months old and Thomas 4 years old, and the property in its best condition since me Dawson's kitchen garden had been at its height, a letter arrived from Robert's older brother in Texas. James Bristol had been managing the family ranch alone since Robert had left, and he was proposing that Robert return to Texas to take over the operation, as James was moving to California on account of his wife's health. The letter was cordial and practical, the kind of letter that people write when they want to appear to be leaving the decision entirely open, while actually making a clear request. Robert brought the letter to Birdie and handed it to her without preamble. She read it. She handed it back. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to stay here," he said. "I want to live here with you and the children and work this land and continue doing what we are doing. That is what I want." "Then we write to James and tell him he needs to find another arrangement," she said. "He will not be pleased." "His pleasure is not our responsibility," she said. "Your happiness is." She paused. "And mine." He wrote to James. James was, as predicted, not pleased, but he found another arrangement eventually, a capable young ranch manager who had grown up in the area and wanted the work. The Texas ranch continued without Robert, and the Arizona homestead continued with him, and the choice was made as clearly and finally as anything could be made, without drama or regret. Martha Harlan, who attended the wedding and the births and the general flow of the Bristol family's life, with the proprietary affection of someone who considers herself a benevolent witness to history, told anyone who asked about the property that it was the finest example of what the frontier could be when people decided to build rather than take. She also told anyone who asked about the marriage that she had known from the moment Robert Bristol walked into her boarding house, asking quiet questions about a woman's homestead, that he was something different, and she had always believed it would turn out this way. Whether she had actually believed it from that moment, or had revised the memory to match the outcome, was a question no one in Cutter's Creek thought it worthwhile to raise, because Martha's conclusions were always satisfying and occasionally accurate. Caroline Finch continued to practice law in Tucson, and rode up to visit 3 times a year, which always involved excellent brandy and long conversations at the kitchen table that ranged from the state of territorial law to the novels she had read on the train to Santa Fe to the development of Thomas Bristol's personality, which she observed with the appreciation of a woman who has chosen not to have children herself, and therefore gets to enjoy other people's without the accompanying loss of sleep. Thomas Bristol grew into a boy who was, as everyone had predicted, opinionated and thorough. He learned to ride before he was 5. He learned to read before he was 6, from his mother, who taught him the same way me Dawson had taught her, with the conviction that books were not supplementary to life, but essential to it. He was perpetually interested in the cattle breeding records, which he studied with the focused attention of someone planning an improvement program, and he had strong and largely unprompted opinions about fence placement that Robert found endearing and occasionally useful. Margaret grew into a child who said less than her brother but observed everything more carefully, which made her assessments, when she offered them, of considerable value. She was her father's shadow in the garden, learning the names of every plant with the patience he brought to such things, including the names Samuel used, which she learned alongside the other names without any apparent sense that one mattered more or less than the other. By 1890, the property had expanded to include an additional 12 acres purchased from a neighboring family who had decided to relocate east. The cattle operation was substantial enough to require 2 additional hired hands, men named Cisco and Pete, who came with recommendations from a rancher in New Mexico, and proved reliable in the straightforward way that the work required. They lived in the expanded bunkhouse that Robert and Samuel had built the previous spring. In the evenings, after the children were asleep, Birdie and Robert sat at the kitchen table, or on the porch they had added to the east side of the house, the side that caught the best light at sunset, and they talked or read or sat in the comfortable silence that had been their first real communication, that Tuesday afternoon fixing the adobe wall when the world had been simple and improbable, and the right kind of strange. "What would you have done?" he asked her one evening on the porch, the children asleep inside, the summer night making the stars extravagant. "If Hatch had won the water rights case," she thought about it honestly. "I would have found another way," she said. "I'm not sure what way, but I would have found it." "I believe you," he said. "I was going to find a way regardless of you," she said. "I want you to know that." "I know that," he said. "I chose to trust you," she said. "That was not desperation. That was a decision." "I know," he said. "And I chose you afterward," she said. "Everything after the agreement was a choice. I want that to be clear." "It has always been clear," he said. She leaned against his shoulder and looked at the stars and felt the weight of the house behind them, with its blue door and its iron pots and its 2 sleeping children and its account books showing a property that was functioning and sound and fully theirs. "My mother would have liked you," she said. "I think about that sometimes," he said. "What I would have said to her, what she would have said to me." "She would have asked you about your intentions immediately," Birdie said. In the direct, cheerful way she had that made the question impossible to avoid. "And I would have told her the truth," Robert said. "Which was what?" "That I came here for practical reasons and stayed for the only reason that matters," he said. She turned to look at him in the dark. "You never said that simply before," she said. "I am saying it simply now," he said. She took his hand and held it, the same way he had taken hers on the night they decided to put both their names on the deed. And they sat together on the porch in the Arizona summer with the stars turning overhead, and the cattle quiet in the pasture, and the house solid at their backs, built by hands that had loved what they were building and cared for by hands that loved it still. In the kitchen, Margaret Bristol, 3 years old and possessed of her father's ability to wake quietly and appear without announcement, padded to the screen door and looked out at her parents on the porch. She stood for a moment, assessing the scene with the gravity of a 3-year-old who has concluded that the adults are adequately occupied, and then she went back to bed. The lamp burned in the kitchen, steady as it had always been. The blue door was latched against the night. The mountains to the east were dark shapes against the sky that had been there before any name for them had existed, and would be there long after. The property sat in the valley with the cottonwoods along the creek bed, and the repaired southern fence, and the kitchen garden, and the well that ran clear and cold from the earth. And it was exactly what it had always been capable of being when the people on it decided that what they were building was worth building fully. Birdie Dawson Bristol sat on her porch in the summer of 1890 and thought about the morning she had stood in the street of Cutter's Creek and told a stranger that he had no right, and how he had answered her, and how that answer had been the beginning of everything that mattered. She thought about her mother in the ground 20 yards from the back door, and her father, whose tools were still on the shelf beside the kitchen window, and Samuel, who had stayed because he loved the land and had taught her children the real name of it. She thought about the auction and the $42.70, and the fact that the only man in that crowd who had raised his hand had done so not to take something, but to hold it for the person it belonged to until she could take it back. It had been a secret of a kind. a hidden motive that turned out not to be sinister but to be the most straightforward kind of decency, the kind that presents itself in a complicated form because simple forms were not available. It had been a forced choice, both of them making choices they had not planned to make under conditions they had not planned to be in. It had been a trap that was not a trap, or a trap that had opened its jaws and revealed something warm inside. Her husband was beside her. Her children were asleep inside. Her mother's land was hers. She thought that this was what her mother had packed the ivory silk dress for, not for the wedding specifically. For the life that turned out to be possible on the other side of the hard years, the life that grew up in the space that hard work and honesty and choosing well had opened. Robert was looking at the stars. "I am glad you came to that auction," she said. He looked at her. "I am glad," he said, "that you told me I had no right." She laughed, quietly so as not to wake the children, and it was the good laugh, the real one, the one that had started beside a collapsed section of adobe wall and that she intended to keep for the rest of her life. The night moved over the Arizona Valley. The lamp burned. The blue door held. The mountains were patient and dark and permanent in the way that only things indifferent to human drama can be permanent. And beneath them the Dawson Bristol homestead rested in the summer dark, whole and claimed and loved, the way a place can only be when the right people decide to stay.